Hello and thanks for joining us at Talking Europe. In these troubled times, are autocratic democracies showcasing their strengths over traditional democracies when it comes to confronting the coronavirus? That's the topic for today's show, where we'll be taking a closer look at the EU's diplomacy. Our guest today is Josep Borrell. Thank you for joining us. You are the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. You wrote an op-ed piece in Le Monde newspaper some weeks ago, saying that this crisis gives us the opportunity to reinforce global governance. But in the end, it's the opposite that's happening. The institutions of multilateralism, the UN criticized for being unable to confront a global virus, the WHO under fire for being too slow to address the pandemic. These global bodies are under threat.
Yes, of course, there are problems. The multilateral system has been weakened in recent years. It's clear that the institutions that should govern the globalized world have not been developing at the same rhythm as globalization has progressed. These institutions date from the post-war period. The world was a very different place back then. And if we want to really govern the world of the future, we must further promote multilateralism, because the unilateral solutions are even worse.
You yourself, the EU's top diplomat, are at the center of this propaganda war, with accusations of diluting a report on how the Chinese authorities dealt with the coronavirus outbreak and their active misinformation. What's your response?
I have requested to address the members of the European Parliament to categorically deny everything about this story. You just need to read the report that we published about misinformation to note that it's not been diluted in any way. No, it has not been watered down at all. As some people say, no one has been putting water in the coffee. This report is completely independent of the EU's Foreign Affairs Service, and it reveals the reality of the situation.
Indeed, when we talk about how multilateralism is facing major challenges, it's because three world powers, the US, China particularly, and also Russia, are attempting to get ahead of Europe and to reserve their response to the pandemic for themselves.
There's nothing new here. In international relations, there's always been a game of power. There have always been the major powers that want to show the rest of the world that they are the greatest, that their system is the best, that they are the best adapted to deal with the situation, that they are doing the most to help other states. It's part of the self-promotion and self-praising. It's nothing new.
It is propaganda, though. It's not simply self-promotion. It's active propaganda, is it not?
I don't know where the frontier between self-promotion and propaganda is. But it's clear when one state helps another state, they like to showcase it. That's both for the domestic consumption, for your own citizens to demonstrate to them, see, we do things that are great. And then it comes to the rest of the world. There's always been a power and an influence struggle. So none of this surprises me.
But does it not call into question the EU? A recent opinion poll in Italy found that 45% of surveyed Italians think Germany is the enemy, 38% for France, while 52% think China is a friend and 32% for Russia. The EU is failing to convince a lot of European citizens, is it not?
Yes, that shows that the EU is not the best when it comes to the ability to show off to others, to explain what we are doing. It's true that at the beginning, the response from the EU was not strong, from certain European countries. But you know, Germany and France, between them, have helped Italy a great deal more than Russia or China have done. But some countries let it be known a great deal more than others. I think we have corrected that, and so I hope this sentiment will be reversed. Because we cannot construct Europe without European citizens feeling pro-European in every country.
Does the crisis demonstrate for you the need for a strong autocratic state, a state that can impose lockdowns and so on, versus weaker democracies?
Look, I'm Spanish. I've seen how Spanish citizens have been very good at following the lockdown rules. I see here in Brussels the streets are empty. I see the situation in France. You cannot say the citizens in democracies have not followed the rules laid out by their governments. I prefer at any level to have a democratic system over an authoritarian system.
You've said that Africa is also a concern, as you said that the pandemic could get out of control very rapidly in Africa. The EU has released funds worth €194 million for the Sahel G5 states and 15 billion for the developing nations, especially those in Africa. Is that going to be enough?
No, it is not enough. As you can imagine, building in Africa a health system that is on a par with the norms we have in Europe is not something that we can do from one day to the next with a few million euros. In Africa, there are 40 times fewer doctors per inhabitant than in Europe. We are not going to be able to bridge this giant gap in one step. But all aid is valuable. So yes, of course, we are preoccupied by what is happening in Africa. Luckily, it seems the virus is not spreading at a rate that we first feared. Africa has some elements in its favour, like the young average age of its population, the climate, some experience of dealing with pandemics, and some problems, of course, like the weakness of its public health systems. But I think the biggest impact will come on the economic level. The economic consequences of the crisis will be greater than the consequences to public health.
C'est pour ça que globalement l'Union européenne demande l'annulation de la dette.
The EU is calling for Africa's debt to be cancelled rather than it being simply suspended, as is currently the case. China holds much of Africa's debt, 40%. Do you hope this pandemic can help get that debt cancelled? Is it a realistic goal for the EU?
It's a necessity much more than a desire. Developing countries are going to bear the brunt of multiple aspects of this crisis. A crisis when it comes to remittance payments sent back home by immigrants, and also a crisis of revenues from exports from oil and natural resources where prices have fallen a great deal. There's going to be a fall in tourism numbers. All of that will hit them hard. We have taken measures for the poorest countries in the world, of which around 40 are in Africa. But in my opinion, it's not enough. So we have asked the International Monetary Fund and the G20 to take stronger measures. We have eased the burden of the debt repayments, but only on the interest, not on the capital, and only for 6 months. In my view, it's not enough. So, like I said, I fear the economic impact will be greater than the public health impact. Africa is set to enter a recession for the first time in 25 years.
Given that all the EU's frontiers are closed, it has helped reduce the flow of migrants towards Europe, especially those coming from Africa. Can we expect them to increase again once the lockdown ends, especially due to the impact of this crisis?
Et dans les années, à cause précisément de cette crise aussi.
We don't know how the lockdown measures will come to an end. We don't know how or when, but it has to be done in a coordinated manner. We can't have different countries opening and closing. They can't be doing that at different times. That would be pointless, both when it comes to the movement of people and even more so when it comes to industry, because the production chain is very interconnected. And so if a factory opens in one country, they need to be supplied with parts from the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world is still closed, there's no point in it reopening. Let's think about the upcoming tourist season too. There is a great deal of coordination that is required. That's why we say it is a global problem, and we can't recover if countries are all doing it on their own. We need a coordination on a global level. The mechanisms for multilateral coordination are not strong enough to deal with a problem of this scale.
You've issued, alongside a number of European foreign ministers, a call for a ceasefire in Libya. The EU, along with the UN, is pushing for a global ceasefire due to the coronavirus. Is that realistic?
We cannot put peace into quarantine. We can't put all our efforts to end this conflict into quarantine just because of the coronavirus. On the contrary, we must be even more active. Some progress has been made, and that should be highlighted. In Yemen and in Afghanistan, for example, there has been some progress with the first prisoner exchanges being made. But in Libya, the opposite is true. The calls for a ceasefire have been ignored, both those from the Berlin Conference and from the UN Secretary-General. Alongside the other European foreign ministers, we are reiterating that call. But instead of the fighting being slowed down by the crisis, unfortunately, it would appear that the situation in Libya is getting worse.
Returning to your own country, Spain, one of the worst-hit countries in Europe, Spain hopes to use technology to fight against the coronavirus. The government has launched a smartphone app which allows people to self-diagnose, as well as to track the position of 40 million phone users to check whether the lockdown measures are working. For you, does this not pose a problem, given your attachment to our basic human rights?
The primary human right is the right to live. We must protect lives. And if to protect lives there needs to be some kind of tracking, with as much privacy as possible guaranteed, if this allows us to save lives, and if it can accelerate us getting back to a normal life and get the economy back on its feet, we mustn't forget the economic impact this crisis is provoking. Then I think the solution must balance all those factors, yes. Spain, France and Italy were the three worst affected countries in Europe. Although, of course, if you calculate the number of deaths per inhabitant, it is Belgium that is the worst hit. Perhaps that means that we're not counting in the same way the victims of the pandemic across all the countries. So there is also a problem of counting methodology.
Spain is only now easing its lockdown measures, having implemented some of the most draconian measures in Europe. But there's also a controversy about your own home region, Catalonia. The local Catalan authorities say that they would have been better able to deal with the crisis, independently of Madrid. What's your view? Was it better to deal with it with a centralized state?
Everyone is allowed to believe that they would have done it better. But in these circumstances, dividing the problems up into small territorial areas and claiming that the problem can be resolved within each small region for a problem that does not recognize frontiers or nationalities, it's not the correct solution. What I'm asking for from the international partners is the same thing I'm asking for from the EU, where we have had our failings, as well as from each member state. Truly, to only look at what is happening around you is not the answer. You know, nationalists of every type are going to try and capitalize on this, and to demonstrate the advantages of each for their own, people closing their doors to the outside world. Honestly, I don't think that is the solution. Looking at how the autonomous local government in Catalonia dealt with the senior persons' care homes, for example, for which they are 100% responsible, you can ask yourself really just how realistic is their demand to be left alone to do it themselves. But it's not just the case of Catalonia and Spain. We saw a similar situation in the United States, where the solution was thought to be closing off the country. That self-defense reflex is perhaps understandable. But when the enemy or the threat does not respect the frontiers that it crosses, then I believe that hiding behind one's frontiers is not a good solution. That is not to say that it was not necessary to limit the freedom of movement, as we did, within and between countries.
Thank you, Josep Borrell, for speaking to us here at Talking Europe. Stay tuned for more news and headlines at France 24.
France 24. Every art form.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.